All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandro Tejada, Director of Major Gifts and the Seton Hall Parents Program. Thank you for joining us during Seton Hall Week. Can't believe it's our final day, and it's our 35th and again final virtual offering. Back where this final offering is our Back to School with McKenna Schray and Kathryn Lancioni, instructors of public relations at the College of Communication and the Arts. This session is being recorded. We will have an on-demand page and we'll add all our Seton Hall Week recorded sessions to the page. Please kindly mute yourself, and if you have any questions during this session, please use the raise your hand icon on the top right of your screen. And please use the chat feature to share your questions or hold your questions until our Q&A session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce McKenna and Kathryn. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate you taking time, especially on a Friday, to learn about public relations. So let me just take a second to introduce myself, and then Dr. Schray will do as well. So my name is Kathryn Lancioni, and I'm one of the faculty members that teach public relations at Seton Hall. We offer both undergraduate public relations and graduate public relations, and I focus on the undergrad. My background is I guess we would call a PR practitioner, having spent over 25 years in the field. For the past 10 years, I've been teaching on the college level while simultaneously working in the industry. I've worked with some of the big agencies such as Edelman, Ogilvy, and Weber Shandwick. I've also worked for a bunch of companies. I've had the pleasure of taking a company public. I've had the pleasure of advising small startups. And I've had the pleasure of making several people billionaires, not myself. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about public relations from the practical standpoint and also from the research standpoint and all the stuff that goes into the behind the scenes work. So let me turn it over to McKenna to introduce herself, and then we'll get into the lecture.
Thank you, Professor Lancioni. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. McKenna Schray. I'm an instructor of public relations. And as a three-time pirate, I am thrilled to welcome you to our session today and share my background with you. I came to Seton Hall almost 10 years ago from Arizona and went on to earn my bachelor's and master's degrees in public relations and my doctorate in higher education leadership. I currently teach public relations and communication courses at the undergraduate and graduate levels. My teaching philosophy is really rooted in student engagement theory and active learning strategies. So in my classroom, my students draw, my students write poems, they play Pictionary, they create memes, and more to really understand and put into practice complex concepts and theories. And those are all activities we actually just did on Wednesday in 4 of my classes. I previously served as an adjunct instructor for the college, an associate director of engagement and experience for the college, and a graduate assistant for the university's Office of Media Relations. My early career includes professional experiences at Scholastic, Coin PR, MTV, and Comedy Central. I was named the state's Future PR Professional of the Year in 2014, and I'm a current candidate for the accreditation in public relations, which is a credential earned by only about 20% of PR professionals. My research interests are Catholic higher education, public relations education, and social media. And I'll share with you that as a product of lifelong Catholic education and as an alumna of the university, I really take great pride and honor in being able to give back to the university and college that has really given so much to me. And I'll share with our parents who are with us today that I really thank them for trusting us to challenge your children to really be the best versions of themselves. And I'll share kind of as a final remark that the very reason I'm even able to do this presentation today and to be here is because of the education I received at Seton Hall. So I now would like to share a little bit about today's agenda. So as Professor Lancioni mentioned, she'll go over kind of an overview of public relations in practice. I will then talk a little bit about public relations research. I'll then lead you in a kind of interactive and collaborative activity, just like we would do in the classroom, and then we'll end our session with a Q&A. So if you have questions throughout, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat, and then we can go ahead and address those at the end of the presentation. So I'll now pass it along to Professor Lancioni to talk a little bit more about public relations in practice.
Okay, so What we've realized here at Seton Hall, and what I've realized by working in industry, is that most people don't know what public relations is. And that was sort of the genesis of this whole lecture. What we've actually found is that most of our undergraduate students, when they come in, don't declare PR as a major. Very, very few do. We get most of our kids declaring a PR major usually in the sophomore year, after they've sort of heard in the hallway about this cool thing that everybody kind of wants to know about, but doesn't really know about. So our goal today is to share with you what PR is all about. So when you say the term public relations, different images tend to pop into people's heads, and it's everything from the character that Sarah Jessica Parker played as Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City. Maybe it's Kerry Washington's character as Olivia Pope in Scandal, or maybe it's Liv Schreiber's character in Ray Donovan, where he played what we call a fixer. And the reality is, in some ways, all these characters exemplify what PR is all about, and in other ways, they really, really do not. Let me tell you, I never had a clothing budget like Sarah Jessica Parker did. I never had nearly as many cool cocktails as she did, and I certainly never got to treat people like Liv Schreiber does in Ray Donovan. So there's a lot of falsities, but there are some realities. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So according to PRSA, which is the Public Relations Society of America, public relations is a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between an organization and their publics. And the term public is really your target audience. And so what that really means is that our goal as PR professionals is to work with companies, nonprofits, large multinational corporations, small startups, to help them figure out who are the right target audiences for them, and then to establish, build, and develop long-lasting relationships with each of those audiences. And no one company has necessarily the same portfolio of audiences. It can range. Some companies are public, and so they have investors as their audiences. Some companies or organizations that we work with are non-for-profits, and so their audiences are very, very different. But ultimately, the goal of public relations is to help whatever type of organization it is identify who the markets are that are important to them, and then how to develop those ongoing relationships with them. Next slide. So possible publics or possible target markets that a lot of companies have are media, investors, employees, customers, suppliers, and community members. And I want to point out something with the first bullet on this slide. A lot of people think that PR just equals press relations. And as we said, it's actually public relations. So the media is actually one of the many publics that most companies work with. The challenge that we face as PR professionals, and I think the challenge for the industry, is that many, many people, if they know anything about PR, perceive that working with the media is all that we do. And yes, I will admit it is a big part of what we do. And yes, I will admit it's a big part of what I've done over the years, but it's not all that we do. And to be honest, it's frustrating because ultimately, truthfully, most clients measure our performance based upon the amount of media coverage or the amount of social media hits that they get, but we do so much more than that. Next slide. So this lovely graphic shows you just some of the many activities of PR professionals. And the first one is media relations, which I just basically talked about. But let me break some of these down. So when I say media relations, what I mean is that the PR professional, like myself, Dr. Schray, and others, what we do is we are the go-between between an organization and the press. And the press in this case can be anybody from the broadcast press, like a CNN or a Fox, or an MSNBC. It can be print media, such as the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. It can be social media influencers, which is a sort of a recent 10-year thing in the industry. And then it can be journalists that are not as high as the national press, something like industry books and trade books. And so what we do is we work with the organizations that we represent, and we work with the media to develop stories and to develop quality stories in publications that are of interest to the groups that we work with. And part of the media goes back to the targeted publics concept. The media that we work with on behalf of our clients are the publications or the outlets or the influencers that we know their audiences go to. So I'm not going to pitch, if I'm working for a sportswear company, I'm not going to pitch or try to work with people in the automotive industry because it doesn't make any sense. So part of that media relations, press relations part is the strategy. Strategy is a big part of PR, and it's something that we teach a lot in the classroom and talk about a lot in the classroom, and that students that intern do get involved with. Strategy and PR is where we set the stage for a company's communications program. And ultimately, what we do is we work with them to decide their targeted publics, and then, of course, the target media that support that. But we also work with them to develop key messages and strategies for helping incorporate PR into other areas of the organization, which we'll get into in a little bit. Social media is another huge part of what we do. When social media first came out about 10 years ago, when it really started to take off, it was one of those things that people perceived that would replace public relations. But what we've realized and what we've seen over the past decade is that social media supports PR, but by all means, it is not PR. Often what companies will do is they'll put together an activity calendar for their PR programs that has a combination of social media work, so doing postings on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, which is the latest and greatest tool, of course, Snapchat and Instagram, and they'll juxtapose that with traditional things, such as press releases, such as meetings with editors, such as special events. Special events is another part of what we do, and that's probably what you think it is. It's when we used to get together in person, it's throwing in-person get-togethers, doing lunches, sort of the Sex and the City part of it, having fun cocktails in cool places. And these days, these things are virtual. So we do conferences virtually. We do, get-togethers with reporters virtually. Of course, due to COVID, some of the stuff has changed, but it's still happening. Another big part of PR is thought leadership, and that's not on this slide. But what thought leadership involves is positioning a client, an executive, a company as a leader in their industry. And what that involves is a combination of speaking events, so speaking at conferences, speaking at industry roundtables, and also writing articles. And what we do is we work with clients to develop articles for publication in national business journals, sometimes industry journals that are right with them, and sometimes in magazines where they take contributed pieces. It also involves doing things like op-eds and editorials for clients. So another part is market research, which Dr. Schray is going to get into in a little bit. And then another part of PR is crisis management and crisis communication. This whole year, the past 7 months have been a crisis for many, many companies. And the importance of PR has come sort of front and center to everybody, because companies and organizations overall, all around the world, are having to wrestle with issues they've never had to wrestle with before. So working with PR people who understand the company's publics, we've been asked to come in and help these companies either rework their messaging to meet the needs of their audiences, or just help reposition the company in a way that there's long-term survival, or that there's the confidence for long-term survival, especially with investors. Next slide. Okay, so on this slide, we have the PPR model, which you'll see is something that I've come up with. So I've got a book coming out in January, and it's called The Practice of Public Relations. And this model is the basis for the whole book. So and this kind of segues into what we just talked about. So public relations really is the communications center of an organization. Everything that we do ultimately gets distilled into other outbound communications functions. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the key messages that we develop in PR then get rolled out to each of these audiences. So they get rolled out to the consumers. Messages about the company that the PR folks develop in concert with the C-suite goes into messaging that goes to the consumer. It gets worked into employee relations, and that everything that we say about the organization will ultimately work its way into the HR department, be it through an employee newsletter, be it through HR materials that are distributed. Crisis communication, as I mentioned, crisis is vital right now. The messages that we develop go into the crisis communications work, and we also work hand in hand with those folks to make sure that needs are being addressed. Public affairs, it's the same thing. The messaging that we develop gets worked into legislative actions that an organization is trying to fulfill, whether at the state or national level. Media relations, we've discussed. Investor relations. If a company is public, meaning they have any outstanding debt, or they have outside shareholders, they have an investor relations person or people within an organization. PR, in the ideal world, works hand in hand with the IR professional to make sure that the messaging is sound on both. I had the opportunity to be the head of an IR department for 5 years while I was also running the PR. And it was brilliant because I got to tell everybody what to do. But more importantly, the messaging was consistent on both sides of the fence. So what we were telling the business media, such as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, we were also telling the Wall Street analysts. And then the final area that PR touches is community relations. You want to make sure that your organization has great relationships with the community that it lives in and the community that it serves online. And again, the messaging that we use in PR gets translated out that way. So in a sort of, I don't know, 10-minute nutshell, whatever that was, that's kind of the overview of PR. But what I want you to understand and the big takeaway is that the media is just one thing of what we do. As you see from this graph, there's so much more that we do, and our influence really is pervasive within an organization. And so now Dr. Schray is going to talk about the research component of PR.
Thank you, Professor Lancioni, and thank you for highlighting what I like to call PR's PR problem, in that no one knows what we actually do. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about public relations research, which really has two sides to it, a more practical kind of side and then an academic side. So when we talk about practical public relations research, research is really the foundation for any communication or public relations plan. So it's simple. It just involves kind of the gathering and interpretation of different types of information about the audience that we're thinking about research or reaching out to. And research is really used in every phase of a communication program, not just at the beginning. And I'll give an example. So often in my PR1 course or kind of entry-level PR courses, students come to me with all these really great ideas about tactics. So, let's go do an event, let's go do a webinar, let's do a social media campaign. And the very first thing I say to them is, do you have the research to support your selection of that tactic? And if the answer is no, I tell them to go back to the research and show me why they think that would be successful. And if we talk about how to make campaigns actually strategic and targeted, research is exactly the key to that. So what does practical research look like? It looks like a content analysis. It looks like interviews. It looks like focus groups, copy testing, surveys. All of these different methods can help us really determine what our audience should be for a particular campaign. And just to kind of give you an idea to kind of wrap up the practical component, again, I can't stress enough the importance that every campaign that you work on really is based and rooted in research. The other side of research is the academic kind of side of it. And this is something that many of us are probably familiar with as well, but academic or scholarly research is really either conducted by an individual or a group of colleagues or peers from an academic institution or across institutions. And usually it's technically part of their job requirement to research and then publish the results of their research. And this is also a component I'll talk about in a minute that I really stress with my students too. The slide you see here is an example of some of the high-profile academic journals in the public relations field. And we're fortunate that even within our college, many of our faculty have had the opportunity to publish in these journals. And again, these are academic journals, academic sources, and these are things that we try to eventually get our students to kind of start thinking about too. I also wanted to give you kind of an idea of what people are researching and what scholars are looking at today. So the slide you see here is kind of a sample of some different topics that have been researched over the past few years. So you'll see that there's topics like mass media, social media. You see things like crisis management, corporate social responsibility. So these are really some of the topics that a lot of scholars in our field are currently focusing their attention on. And I would imagine with COVID as well, we'll kind of see crisis management kind of come full circle back again in terms of different scholars' research agendas. So what does academic research look like, and what does it mean for our students in the classroom? So again, if they're working on a public relations or communications plan, they are researching every single phase. I task almost every single class that I teach with doing a literature review. And that's because I don't want the first time that my students encounter a literature review to be in a course like senior seminar. I want them to be scholars at the very start. They also, at the end of our program, they have to write a thesis. And then if they ever go on to pursue any further graduate studies, they'll have to write a thesis for their graduate degrees and then, of course, a dissertation for their doctorate. So it's something that I really try to instill in my students. And I'll end with just this kind of story. And we have a student who's on our call here today named Madison, and I won't put her on the spot, but Madison knows that I say this multiple times a semester. And it's that, the majority of students who leave a public relations program across any university in the nation, any credible university, they're probably going to know how to write a press release, right? They're probably going to know how to do kind of very technical skills, entry-level skills. But what they're maybe not going to know how to do, or maybe what was not emphasized for them, is how to think critically and how to research. And for me, if a student is able to grasp this concept and some of these things that we see on the slide here, that to me is how they can set themselves apart from peers from other institutions. So for my students, they know that research is big in every single thing that we do. And I challenge them to really think past kind of those technician skills and think more at the manager level and beyond. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what public relations research looks like. What I'd like to do now is an interactive activity, and we're I was a little bit limited in deciding what our activity could be because we're using Teams on guest access for many of you. But I wanted to give you a little taste about if you were in my class right now, kind of some of the things that we would work on. So I want to do an interactive activity using the hand raise function. So depending on what kind of version you have of Teams, it's either kind of at the bottom of your screen here where you see the screenshot kind of circled, or it might be on the top kind of right-hand side. That's where your hand raise feature is too. So what I want to do is I'll just ask kind of some basic questions, and we'll kind of test the hand raise feature before we get into our activity. So what I'd love for those of you who are with us, would you be able to raise your virtual hand if you are a parent? Great, okay. So I see some hands. And I'm going to do exactly what I do in the classroom, which is put my students on the spot and challenge them a little bit. So Nora, I was wondering if you have the availability to, would you be willing to maybe unmute your mic and share with us, the student that you have at Seton Hall and maybe what they're studying?
Hello, yes. I have a sophomore. His name is Niall Polk, and his major is in mathematics.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Nora. So my husband is a Seton Hall alum, and he studied mathematics. He's been in the same job since graduation 7 years ago, and he's doing very well. So congratulations on picking a great major. And he's not a teacher. He's not a teacher. He's in data analytics for healthcare. So congrats on choosing a great major. Great. Let's see. Next up, Deborah, if you feel willing to share, would you want to share your child's maybe what they're studying?
Sure. My daughter is Madison Vance, so you know her.
Yeah.
She's a PR major, so.
Good, wonderful. Well, thank you, Deborah. It's very nice to meet you. And Madison is a wonderful student. I have her in 2 of my courses, and I'm working on our Bateman competition with her. So hopefully she says good things about me too. Fingers crossed.
She does. That's why I'm here.
Good, good. Thank you, Deborah. Let's see. Steve, would you be willing to share with us as well?
Certainly. Hello. My son is Robbie Duchesne. He's a freshman in the Stillman School, double majoring in finance and sport management. You might be wondering, why is his parent here today? I'm a public relations consultant, have been all my life. Writing, crisis communications, public affairs, that's my wheelhouse.
Amazing. So Steve, I'm a little disappointed you couldn't persuade him to the PR side, but I think we'll be able to get over it. But if he ever wants to join us, he's more than welcome to.
I talk to all of my kids. I talk to all of my kids about the value of writing and communications. And I've got 2 business students in college, and the one who's out, took my advice. So.
Good, good. Well, in any case, they're in good hands in the Stillman School of Business. My little brother is also a graduate of Seton Hall. He graduated with a degree in economics. Same with him. He's been in his same job for about 3 years now, and probably makes triple what I make. So he's in good shape there.
Excellent. That's
Good, good. Thanks for sharing, Steve.
Thank you.
All right, so now I want to see, we'll see if we have any alumni on the call with us. If we have any alumni, would you be willing to raise your virtual hand? See if we have anyone with us. Maybe not. Okay. In any case, that's a good example for and a good segue for our activity that we're going to do next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to display a few different prompts on the screen. They're all going to be true or false prompts. So what you'll want to do is if you believe that the statement is true, you'll want to raise your virtual hand. If you believe it's false, you'll want to go ahead and no action kind of required. You don't need to raise your virtual hand. And then we'll kind of have a very, very brief discussion after each of those points, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and display our first statement here. So again, true or false, PR is about building and maintaining positive relationships between an organization and its targeted public. If you believe that this statement is true, you can go ahead and raise your virtual hand. If you believe it is false, no action is required. Great. Wonderful. So if you guys were all in my class, you would pass at least my initial kind of introductory activity there. So thank you so much for participating in that one. So as we know from Professor Lancioni and PRSSA's definition of public relations, it really is all about building mutually beneficial relationships. If you could go ahead and lower your virtual hand now, you can do that just by hitting that hand raise function again. Great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next prompt now. True or false, an advertisement is an example of a PR activity. If you believe that this is true, you can go ahead and raise your hand. If it's false, no action is required. Great, wonderful. So often we get asked the question, how is public relations different than marketing or advertising? And really the biggest distinction between advertising and public relations is that advertising is obviously, you pay for an advertisement versus public relations professionals, and Madison knows this, we have to work really hard and we have to earn many of the things that we do in terms of whether that's getting media attention, whether that's working on a social media campaign and trying to get engagement. So again, advertising professionals work very hard too, and they have to be very, very creative. But as PR professionals, we also really have to make sure that we're positioning our clients or our organizations in a way that we actually do earn that attention or get our publics to buy into our campaigns as well. So great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move to the next prompt now. The next one is public relations research can be practical and academic. So again, if you can go ahead and raise your hand. If you believe it is false, no action is required. Good. Great. So this is true as well. So often when we hear the term research, we think of it as just something academic, or maybe that just professors do or scholars do. That's simply not true. And as PR professionals, it's something I really, as I mentioned, kind of push my students to think very critically and at a higher level than some of their peers at other institutions. So great. I'd ask that you please lower your virtual hands now, and we'll go ahead and transition to our last statement here. So our last statement is true or false. Research is only used in the beginning of a communication program. If you believe that this statement is true, you can raise your hand. If you believe it's false, no action is required. Great. Wonderful. So with this one, we know that really research is part of every single stage that we work on. So it's obviously in the research component. We have to think about it when we're writing our objectives, when we're doing our evaluation, when we're selecting our tactic. We always have to refer back to that kind of practical research that we've done. And I also encourage my students to even lean on kind of academic sources or journal articles when studying and thinking about campaigns as well. So great. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for participating, in that activity. That, again, like I said, is something that we really do in the classroom here, especially in our high flex model. So I hope you enjoyed kind of the opportunity to participate and go back to school a little bit. What I'd like to do now with our kind of remaining time is go through a Q&A. So if you have a question, you're more than welcome to raise your virtual hand and ask a question, or you may write your question in the chat as well. And then we can kind of go from there. So I'll open the floor now to any questions that anyone may have. I see someone typing now. Steve, you have a question as well?
Yeah, I'll happily kick it off.
Great. Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm going to reveal myself as an old guy here. I'm 55, and unfortunately, the vast majority of my clients are younger, and they can be 10 years to 20 years younger. My question is this: some seem to think that social media is much of a PR program. They don't seem to accept the value of more traditional vehicles like news releases and other forms of writing, which in my view is the foundation for even social media activity. How would you convince younger clients of the value of those more traditional forms of communication?
Great question, Steve. And maybe I can answer it kind of from my perspective, and then maybe Professor Lancioni can as well. For me, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about in regards to my students, but if a student comes to me with ideas about tactics, and we can kind of liken this to working with a client in some ways, obviously a little bit of a different dynamic there, but it happens all the time. Students come to me, oh, let's do this webinar, let's do this event. And like I said, the very first thing I say to them is, so what's the research that you've done about your audience, or what's the academic research that you've done or reviewed that shows the supporting of that tactic? 9 times out of 10, they don't have anything. And so what I tell them to do is go back and show and find that, or find a tactic that is kind of more appropriate. And with social media, I have, even in my classes, one of the wrap-up activities that we do, it's surprising a lot of the younger generation, and I'll admit I'm part of it, they like to think, oh, we know how to use all these social media platforms. I just did an activity in my class the other day, and I had students summarize their biggest key takeaway from my class by writing a tweet or a Facebook post. And you would be surprised, but about 4 or 5 of the students said, I don't even have those social media accounts, or I don't know how to write a tweet. And that's where, we really have to work on them and have them understand that writing is such an important component of public relations. And if you can't write, whether that's in a press release or a social media post, it doesn't matter. So from my perspective, that's how I approach it in the classroom. And I'll literally, in a kind way, kind of challenge the student on the tactic that they've brought forth, whether that's a social media campaign or whatever it is, and say, show me the research, validate why you've selected that. And that really seems to challenge them. Professor Lancioni, is there anything that you wanted to add, maybe from the client perspective, given your professional experience?
Yeah, so Steve, I just finishing up a book that we surveyed or spoke to 30 different PR pros from around the world, so globally. And I mean, when I mean around the world, I've even got Kazakhstan in there, which Borat, I'm sure, would approve of. And what we're finding, and one of the big questions, and the data is going to be published in January. One of the big questions that was asked was, what PR techniques have gone away, and has social media replaced traditional PR? And what came back, and what's interesting about it is the respondents were anywhere from 7 years in the industry on up to 30. So we get the millennials, we get the Gen X, we get and not Gen Z, but we get a lot of folks. And what came back was that hands down, everyone agrees there's still a place for traditional PR tactics. And I was very specific in what I asked. I asked about press releases. I asked about fact sheets. I asked about interviews. And so what's come back is that what's relevant and what's important right now is a combination of those traditional PR techniques interwoven with social media and influencer-based PR. You know what, the one thing that has come back is that the idea of leading with a press release has gone away. Like, there's got to be some social media component to support the distribution of that press release, but that's not rocket science. Like, you and I both knew that. So what I would say to your clients, and again, I'm more than happy to share the research with you once it comes out, is that hands down globally, there's still a need for the traditional tactics. And you know, if you talk to reporters, which I'm sure you do, just like I do, from, you know, the very, very top publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, what they say, again, hands down, is they just want someone intelligent to speak with them about a topic. And if they get too many tweets, too many emails following up on an email, that sort of thing, they're going to shut it down. So I think, but the reality is we need a combination of both. Most social media posts, as we know, are very short, whereas press releases have a lot of a longer lifestyle. People keep going into the chat. It's I'm kind of distracted. Sorry. So the press release has to be used. The media interview has to be used in concert with more modern techniques, if you want to call it that. So that's what I've said to clients, and that does seem to. There has to be an appreciation for both parts of it.
Good, great. Thank you, Professor Lancioni, for providing your perspective as well. Looks like we have a question in the chat from Deborah. And Deborah says, I agree how important writing is for communications. As part of the curriculum, do you teach how to write for the different platforms so that they understand what works in a tweet isn't going to be the same as a PR or an interview? So I can kind of answer again from my perspective, and then Professor Lancioni can as well. Yes, you know, I think our curriculum really allows for, whether that be in our core courses or electives that students select, to be exposed to that really in every single class. And one of the things that I try to do based on, again, kind of student engagement theory, but also active learning strategies, is I'll challenge my students to write, whether I gave the example of, you know, give me a Facebook post, give me a tweet, write a news article. And it's not so much, you know, how you would do that for a particular client, but I'll literally ask them to take the key takeaway from class today and practice writing in different kind of methods and forms. Writing is so important. And again, this is why I really place an emphasis on research, because as a researcher, you have to know how to write and convey your ideas. So again, I think if we really kind of focus on that component with a student, in my opinion, it can really set them apart. And as someone, as I mentioned, studying for my accreditation in public relations right now, I just met this week with kind of the head of New Jersey on the APR. And the same thing he said to me was 9 times out of 10, the candidates that sit for us, they don't realize how important research is, and they're skipping straight ahead, you know, to those kind of tactics. So writing, research, those are things that we certainly emphasize in the classroom. Professor Lancioni, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, curriculum for the PR majors, we start with intro to media writing. We then go into PR1, we have PR2, and then we have a bunch of courses in the middle, and then we wind up with senior SEM. And writing is a strong component of all of those classes, and then some. In the PR1 class, both Dr. Schray and I teach, the students are tasked with learning how to write everything from a bio to a press release to a social media post to a tweet to a fact sheet to a backgrounder to an executive summary. So that takes them through all of the key components that the kids need from a PR standpoint. We then reinforce that in PR2, where we get into client contact, and that's one of the courses that I teach in client counseling. Students are taught how to use those materials they've learned how to develop already in concert with counseling clients. They're also taught how to write media plans that incorporate the research that Dr. Schray has been talking about, and use the research as the basis or for the public that they're recommending to the client. And then in senior STEM, the students write a very, very in-depth research paper, which is based upon a huge amount of academic research and a huge amount of industry research. And then that research ultimately turns into a very comprehensive plan
they then talk about. So it's about a 50-page paper that has a strong academic research component and then a strong sort of pragmatic industry component. So the kids aren't going to get out of our program without being great writers. And that, you know, if you look at, we each have gotten involved in PR for various reasons. You know, as I told you guys in my intro, I've been in the industry forever. I was a communications major at Cornell and a journalism major at Columbia, and never ever thought I was going to wind up in public relations. And I did, and I loved it. And the reason I got involved teaching was not because I meant to be a career academic. It was because I wanted to create some great PR people, because I had encountered so many bad ones. And one of the hallmarks of great PR, of excellent PR, is writing. So, you know, the kids aren't going to leave our program without becoming excellent writers.
Great. Thank you, Professor Lancioni. And just to add to that, too, Deborah, kind of a final comment there is, as someone who's pursued their doctorate, you know, I think that the writing that I learned in PR, even though it's a different type of writing, kind of academically writing a literature review or a thesis or a dissertation, the things that were instilled in me as a graduate of the program certainly helped me succeed kind of further on in my graduate studies and having that ability to write. So thank you for your question. It looks like we have a question from Crystal, and Crystal says, given COVID-19, how have you virtualized social events that you may hold for clients that in the past usually include a meet and greet or social/cocktail hour? I can share a little bit about actually an event we kind of had last week, and then Professor Lancioni can comment as well. So the college recently, last week had the Institute for Communication and Religion that we have had a conference on the presidential election. And this was originally supposed to be held in March. It was supposed to include kind of, you know, different components, even some social components. So obviously we did transition that to basically a virtual conference last week. And one of the things that we did was we had a live debate watch party. So it's really just about being creative about things. I've also read some examples of many organizations to have something like a social or cocktail hour. They go and mail out or send out kind of a cocktail that, you know, the ingredients that everyone can make and then pop on to the call. So I've read about fashion shows that are being done, you know, via Zoom or via Teams. So I think it's about, and even to be honest with you, I even think about it from a pedagogy perspective as a professor and as a teacher. What I do is I do the exact same thing that I would do if we were all in person, and I just find a way to transition it online. And so the experience that the students are getting are the same, and the same thing could be said for, you know, clients too. I think it's about being creative and thinking, okay, how can I transition this online? And I guarantee you there's a way somehow. Professor Lancioni, do you want to comment on that as well?
Just to add very, very briefly, I mean, I think the phrase reimagine is quite popular in society right now. And I think, you know, what we've seen with clients is, as Dr. Schray is saying, it's just a matter of reimagining the experience. You know, you can easily pop some people on Zoom and create the kind of conversation that you would. You know, the challenge is just making everybody believe that. But I think what we're seeing is, for the most part, be it a media interview, be it a virtual conference, be it just some sort of virtual get together, it is possible. And in some ways, it's better. I mean, I know I'm speaking at a conference next week that's being sponsored by a group out in the Midwest. And normally that would be something that probably wouldn't even be able to speak at because of where it is and the timing of it. But because it's a virtual conference, they've been able to invite folks like myself who aren't from the Chicago area to participate in it. And more importantly, they're able to get attendees from all over the world. So just like Dr. Schray was saying about the activity she was involved in last week, the event she was involved in last week, this whole virtual situation has been challenging. But what we're seeing is it's opening up opportunities, and it's developing ideas for things that we never had before. I mean, one of the most fun things I've done, not in my life, is I've done a lot of virtual wine tastings. And just like Dr. Schray was saying, the vineyard sends you the wine, and you get online and you go through the tasting with the vintner, and it's really been quite fun. So I think you know, things are different, but we're still able to achieve most of what we are when we're in person, and sometimes even more.
Good. Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Lancioni. And, just to, I guess, highlight that too. So I have kind of a roster of those who registered today. And Steve, I see that you're from Redondo Beach, California. I don't know if are you in California right now, Steve?
I am.
Okay, so this is a perfect example about how virtual events actually open up the access. So Steve, if we were in person doing Seton Hall weekend, which is normally literally just over, a Saturday and Sunday, Steve may or may not have been able to join us because he may have not had the, the time or the capabilities to fly across the country and join us. But now that we're seeing, how I like to look at this is really as an opportunity instead of a challenge, and an opportunity for our students to be creative, for as PR professionals to be creative. And again, it allows individuals who wouldn't normally be participating in events to actually participate. And Steve's a great example of that.
I would like to second that. I've actually been able to, I live in San Diego, and there's been a couple events that, I would get invites before, but it wasn't even an option. So it does open it up and allows people that aren't in New Jersey to engage. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And that's something we're really seeing, across the industry, Deborah. So great. Wonderful. Are there any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat, but are there any other questions?
I have a question, Sandro.
Sure.
I'm interested, especially now with Twitter being such a platform for celebrities and politicians, and sometimes, a lot of times they're putting their foot in their mouth with statements or even things that they've said in the past. So I just feel like, in regards to, especially if you have clients that are in that realm, managing that as more of a crisis management, so to speak, in the sense of managing what they're writing, because a lot of it could be, crisis management or, handling those types of communications that can destroy reputations. And how to
absolutely.
Yeah.
Good. So I can provide my perspective on that, Sandro. So my dissertation is actually on social media policies and guidelines at Catholic institutions. So to answer your question, one way to help mitigate that risk is not only social media policies or best practices for organizations, but what I found is that most of these policies don't actually lay out kind of the consequences for violating the policy. So I think, we're slowly going to see kind of the involvement of more social media policies and people understanding that there actually is consequences. So that's kind of my initial reaction in regards to mitigation of those risks. But the second thing, and this is something I tell my students, I tell them, I Google myself once a month. I'll search myself online. I'll see what's kind of coming up, and then I'll also conduct a social media audit of my own personal profiles. And it's the same thing that you'd have to do for an organization. So, that tweet or that post that you posted 10 years ago or 8 years ago, make sure that that's either no longer there or it's hidden or whatever it is. So it's also something at the student level that I really encourage them to do. And I tell them all the time, you don't have to be active on social media, but you should at the very least have accounts in all these platforms because you have to understand the content. But if you don't feel comfortable kind of sharing in that capacity, I don't push that based on my research because as we see countless examples in the media of that can come right back at you, even though it's something 10 years ago or whatever it was. So thank you, Sandro. Professor Lancioni, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I mean, I just think that one of the things that I know we both tell our students is the importance of keeping up with your social media profile and Googling yourself before a job interview, before you're going for an internship interview. I too probably Google myself a bit too much, but it's important to know what's out there about you and what's being said about you. And the other thing that we always tell the students is that it's important to realize that once you post it, it's really hard to make it go away. So, posts live forever. It's Facebook stuff, Instagram, Snapchat, it's there forever. So, and some students, they realize it, but they don't think it. It doesn't necessarily make sense until something bad happens and something embarrassing happens as a result of an online post. So I know that in our classes, that's one thing that we really underscore is that social media is a blessing, but it's also a vice. And so, there's ways to use it smartly, and then there's a lot of ways to not use it intelligently, which we see day after day in the media.
Good, great. Thank you, Professor Lancioni. Looks like we have a question from Michelle. Michelle, do you want to share your question with us?
Afternoon. I know my connectivity is spotty today for this class, unfortunately. So that's, I guess, both the upside and downside to virtual interaction. Opportunity as a been able to take advantage. I know for me, for work, jump right into this whole approach to community people in my office. I'm on both sides of the fence, to be honest with you. It was a pleasure to be able to participate in the class as much as I could, even in spite of the connectivity issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We appreciate your comments and agreed. There's certainly advantages and disadvantages, but we're very happy to have had you today. So thank you, Michelle. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up our session today?
I have one other question, and I know it's, talking to students, especially this semester, dealing with COVID, especially those that are looking to graduate in 2021. Can you share, and you and Professor Lancioni as well, what is the job market for those that are interested in going into the PR field now, especially now that with internships kind of shrinking, the possibility of shadowing limited in a lot of corporations. So if you can kind of share a little bit of an outlook for those that are, especially your students, and what they're asking you, what do you think I should do? Should I continue going in? Should I go to graduate school now just to see if things, so just any thoughts on that and advice that you can give to students that are about to go into the job market?
Let me take the lead. Let me start off on this one since I have a senior SEM class. So a couple of things that we're finding, Sandra, and it's a great question. The first thing is that there is, on the grad school front, there is a huge interest in grad school. I know I spent about a half an hour talking to a student the other day about continuing along in the Seton Hall graduate program for PR, and I think they're going to do it, which is great. So it's definitely a good time to go to grad school, but it's always a good time to go to grad school. I mean, I know that I always say, I kind of happened in the grad school because I actually got laid off from my first journalism job because the magazine folded. And I found myself accepted into the part-time program at Columbia. And I was like, well, I might as well go back full-time. And I did. And it was single-handedly the greatest decision I ever made was to go to grad school. So if any of you have students at Seton Hall that are thinking about the grad program, I would encourage them because it can be life-altering because it opens up so many doors. As far as the job market right now, it's tough. It's not as tough as it may seem because a lot of companies are actually hiring, but they're hiring virtually. So what that means is that I think it's in some ways easier if a student gets a job because it's kind of a nice way to try something out. You don't have to commute into the office. You can just do the work at home. But the challenge is then you don't get to know the corporate culture. But what we are finding is companies are hiring, but competition for the jobs is more. And some of these students, not our seniors, but some folks that have graduated in prior years, they didn't realize how competitive it had gotten. And some folks I know turned down jobs because it wasn't exactly the right thing. And what they're realizing now is that, you may never find exactly the right thing, and they're wishing they had taken those opportunities. And the most PR firms are starting to reactivate their internship programs. There was nothing over the summer, but we are starting to see some internship opportunities become available for students as well. But I know Dr. Schray and I are both encouraging our students, both those that are graduating and those that are continuing on at Seton Hall, to really consider everything and anything that's offered to them. We were on a call earlier this week with our PRSSA group, which is our student organization of PRSA. And this whole thing came up about interning and volunteering your time and working. And what distinguishes students is the amount of practical experience that they've had. And I know our program is very robust in the sense that we offer students great ways to get market to get industry experience without even actually having to leave the campus. Through our PRSSA program right now, our students have the opportunities to work on 3 actual client programs. And then we have this wonderful internship office that is great at connecting students to alum and to industry. And then we, of course, have the CHAMP mentorship program. So Sandra, to answer your question, there are jobs. The competition is tough. I think grad school is a great thing for people to think about right now, because I do believe in 18 months, the job market for PR pros will be a lot better. But the importance of PR has never been so showcased due to this whole COVID crisis. So I think that the current market for PR, although challenging, just like it is for anything, over the long term, it showed the importance of PR professionals.
Good. I mean, the only thing that I'll add to that is that, in general and kind of based on some research that I've done, is that, growth for public relations positions are really expected to grow faster than the average of all positions in general and all positions within communication and arts, period. So, obviously we'll see how that might tweak, but I think in general, our outlook of the field is very, very positive. In terms of kind of the research that we have. So great. Wonderful. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? All right. Well, I think we got to everyone. I want to thank you again so much, for your time. It was lovely to connect with so many of you. And please feel free to stay in touch or reach out at any time. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all for taking the time.
Thank you.
We're both on link too, if you want to link in with us. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Lancioni and Professor Schray. Thank you so much for your time. This was awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Everyone have a great weekend. Be safe.
Take care.